So our moderator for this panel, Disrupting the Traditional Industry, is Galen Moore. He is the editor-in-chief of Streetwise Media, and the most notable outlet you probably know here in the Boston area is BostInno. So again, please introduce your panelists and get started.
Music's awesome. So hi, thanks for the introduction. My name's Galen, as you just heard. So I'm editor-in-chief of Streetwise Media. We publish BostInno here in Boston and similar publications in Chicago, DC, and Austin. And I'd let the panelists introduce themselves. Why don't you guys go through, say your name, say your company, what you do, and what industry are you disrupting currently?
I already introduced myself before. I refuse to leave the stage, so I'm still here.
Security's on his way.
We're in the commercial real estate tech industry. So commercial real estate would be the industry, I suppose, that Compstak is disrupting, but we try not to use the word disrupt because it's such an old school industry that if people feel like we're disrupting them, they'll rebel against us.
I'm Goscha. I was the founder of IdeaPaint and founded a company called the BlankLabel company, and we are in the consumer lighting business. So.
Hi, my name is Mandel. I'm with BlankLabel. We're a custom menswear brand, actually following BostInno around the country because we're in Boston, DC, going to Chicago next. Maybe you guys will hire us. Maybe there's an opportunity.
We'd like to.
Yeah, so we're disrupting the men's clothing business.
Great. So disruption is this huge buzzword, but presumably it still has some meaning. So what does it mean when you hear people say an industry is ripe for disruption? It seems like we rarely hear the word disruption without hearing the word ripe. So what does that actually mean, and how do you know? I mean, how would you know if an industry is ripe for disruption?
I'll go first here. I don't know the view that everything is ripe for disruption. That might be kind of a cop-out answer, but you know, one of the things that you see everywhere, and I see this as reinvention. I see my friends at Method who reinvented soap. Who thought that soap could be reinvented? You see new entrants into the toothpaste category. Us with the light bulb or before the whiteboard. So I think any industry can be disrupted. The older, the better, I guess, because people change, and what they want changes. So you look at what was happening with let's just take Method as a quick example. We had companies like Clorox, and this stuff sounds like it fell right off the periodic table. It came from the space race. Where the coolest thing other than being Jackie O was being the wife of an astronaut. And it sounded like chemicals. People wanted chemicals, but today we don't want chemicals. We want things that we can eat off of. So why are we gonna buy Clorox? So the older the better would be my opinion. Just because people change or they want changes.
So branding, image, sometimes not up to date, right? Does technology play a role as well? Like how do you know when you have a technological opportunity in the disruption category?
I think that if you look at the players in the market, is it a saturated market or not, and what's the nature of the people who dominate it? So in commercial real estate tech, there's one massive company that has been sort of the evil monopoly that dominated the space and is an old company and not very innovative.
Is that good or bad? Is that an opportunity?
I think that creates
that
an
giant
opportunity.
gorilla is going to squash you.
Well, I think that giant gorillas are there to be disruptive, and when the older and more slow-moving they are, the more that there's some sort of creative way to just kind of get their Achilles heel. So I think that creates an opportunity for disruption. The other thing that I look at in the commercial real estate space is we're in commercial real estate data and information, and the percentage of revenue that real estate owners invest in technology is very, very small. And when you compare that to the percent of revenue that's invested in technology in, for instance, like the equities market or the bonds market, it's significantly higher. And yet, the commercial real estate market, the asset class is larger than the equities market. It's the only market that's larger than the bottom market. It's a massive market with very small technology spend, and you have to assume that that'll have to change.
You're looking at not just what the incumbents, your potential competitors are doing, but also what your customers are doing to determine whether there's room for something new to come in.
Yeah, yeah, and what they're not doing to some extent too. It's like, okay, because there's this space, there's this potential to expand the market size, you know, that isn't even, there is no player in that space.
So software is eating the world, and commercial real estate is next.
Yeah, fair enough.
What about fun? What do you think? What do you see in clothing?
Yeah. So before I get started, I wanted to say I'm really jealous of your mic piece, because I really like to gesticulate, and
well,
next time I want to make sure I get that mic
yeah,
piece.
well, I also noticed you eschewed the name tag, which shows off your excellent line score there.
I did notice you had a nice moment for it as well, you know. I want to be credited.
Jealousy is mutual.
So, yeah, I guess I think a couple of things. You know, to answer your first question about disruption, like how do you find something that is disruptive? I think one framework is, I can't remember exactly who said it, but I think it was Mark Andreessen that said, you know, you should look for opportunities where the product can be 10 times better. Now that's a very quantifiable lens, and it's hard to sometimes like ask, is your product idea or your product, you know, really 10 times better? But at least give some perspective as to what you should be looking for. And I really like what John said about, are there any social changes? So, you know, I think we were less crunchy granola bar eating, even though I like them, you know, 10 years ago than we are today. And, you know, what a great opportunity for Method to say, you know, this is a really big trend, is a shift in consumer awareness. Let's make sure that, you know, we're jumping on that. For us, we really see that as the opportunity more than technology. So in our space, 90% of clothing sold happens off the rack. And technology hasn't made as much of an impact as I think a lot of people thought. So, and it's moving pretty slowly online as well. You know, it's a couple of percentage points. So it's going to be a while before you're seeing the majority of clothes happen online. And for us, the change that we really looked for was actually the way the clothes fit for men. So if you think about, you know, ads that you see for men's clothing, whether it be Brooks Brothers or Nordstrom or J. Crew, the defining word of the last 5 to 10 years is fit. And men today care more about the way their clothes fit. If you've ever seen kind of NBA draft photos of 10 years ago, there's some pretty ridiculously fitting clothes, and today they're just, you know, fully tailored and men care about that today. So kind of, we saw that as an opportunity that, you know, men cared about the way their clothes fit. Off the rack isn't necessarily a good sole for that. In fact, it's a very bad sole for that. How do we make it a better sole?
So you're in this slow changing industry, right, where technology adoption, and I think you probably are too, Mike, where technology adoption is a very slow curve, right? How do you know when the timing is right to be disruptive? How do you know when you're, you know, too early?
I think that for me personally, I'm just not that smart, at least to predict a future wave. And you know, the Method guys or Stanford GSB, you know, I probably had half their SAT score. But for me, I believe that, you know, you should do something you're really, really passionate about. Startups are really, really tough. And so for me, it was more kind of something that I was passionate about that then kind of evolved into an opportunity. Even if there wasn't necessarily a shift in the market, I think I probably still would have stuck with it.
Yeah, I know I'm always a little bit late. Honestly, you look at it like, you know, in my first round of VC money I raised in 2008, right, when the real estate crash was happening. You know, I started a light bulb company, right, the LED was taking over the world. So I'm in a market that's, I think, the opposite of what you guys are in, one that's changing remarkably fast. We've seen, you know, a LED computing technology go from, you know, being diodes and, you know, blinking in your computer to being light bulbs in a matter of years. But you know, one thing that I think is important to look at is, you know, technology is, I think, the number one area that I've always looked to say, okay, that can disrupt something. You know, can that, you know, what can we do today that you couldn't do yesterday? But you know, I found that a lot of people, they use technology just because they can, not because it actually makes people's lives better. You know, so I see a lot of people in our industry, you know, doing things like, okay, you know, be able to change the color of your light bulb, or, you know, be able to turn it on and off from your phone. You know, I wired up my house with that, you know, years ago, and was trying to, you know, it's a pain in the butt to take out your phone and you open the app and turn the lights. It's so much easier to hit the switch. And lo and behold, you have, you know, things like the Philips Hue that have kind of been, toys in the market, but really haven't taken off from a revenue standpoint. So you see a lot of applications of technology in ways that are kind of neat and fun, but they're gadgets. So it's looking at what does the technology really make people's lives better. One of the important things in our products has been you have to be a great light bulb first. Everyone wants to take technology and go and make the product do X or Y, but at the end of the day, I think it's a service purpose. You look at the product and at its core, it's a very boring value add. Like, what does it do? It creates light, it's better light, it's energy efficient.
So again, kind of considering the customer.
Yeah.
Considering how the customer's gonna use it, and if that use case is there, then the adoption.
Yeah, it's easy to get the wow factor, but the boring useful stuff is what actually makes money.
What about explaining yourself? And I think, Mike, you touched on this early on, talking about trying to sell something to a very conservative buyer, a commercial real estate agent. I would think that maybe if you're starting to feel like you're too early, one of the symptoms might be it takes you 30 minutes to explain just what the hell you're doing to the people who you need to be buying it.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge for sure, and I think that's why, like I said, we don't want to be thought of as disruptive, but more transformative. And so the way that we went about it, so as to avoid sort of this too early, too late thing, was to try to take an offline process that people were used to doing and move it online, so that really their workflow was not substantially different. So we took the process of the fact that commercial real estate brokers and appraisers were trading information with each other over the phone and via email and in meetings, and we said, okay, here's a more fair way for you to trade, and now you can trade them online. You put the data in the database, you can get the same amount of data back out. You're already doing this, you're just doing it in a better way. It still took some explanation, because I think people made their assumptions as to what we were, which weren't necessarily what we were doing. But so it was a lot of just trying to get in front of people and build relationships, and you can do that maybe a little better in a specific industry, and where you can actually talk to people one-on-one if that's what you need to do, and become on their side.
How long do you guys think it should take to explain something that you're doing that's new, it's never been done before, it's transformative, disruptive? Is there like a, big set like a 30-second elevator pitch? Is there like a time limit on how much time you find yourself taking to explain this thing?
I mean, the ones that work, I think, are one sentence. Our company, I don't ever tell people this because it confuses them, but we started out with a light bulb that can pay for itself, and you're like, what? And you need like another 30 minutes to like explain how that all works, and ultimately the confusion was the death of the idea. If you have something that's very easy to explain in one sentence, and people are like, yeah, I get it, that's going to be the key to everything from raising money to selling it. The confusion, the longer it takes you, the harder the road ahead is.
One sentence explanation. Tom,
yeah, I think that we're in a category that has been around for literally tens of thousands of years, right? One person made clothes for another person specifically. But for us, I think it is still really important to explain the value proposition. And we actually started with a question. We think very much about the problem-solution paradigm. And we asked, the very first time a client comes into one of our stores, we ask them, do you have trouble finding clothes that fit off the rack? If they say no, like that's not a good person for us, and like we did a really bad job of filtering them in our marketing messaging. So if they say yes, we're going to be really good friends, but so we try to understand the problem first.
For what it's worth, I think it's kind of interesting. These two guys are both building companies that allow people to do things the way they used to do them. So you're building a light bulb that is more like incandescents, because that's what people used to use, and they like them better than the fluorescents. And you're allowing people to have clothes made for them, which is what used to happen before people bought them off the racks. For what it's worth, this is kind of interesting.
Disruption isn't always this.
We're on
Can that be the official hashtag?
So I also wanted to ask about this notion of being a feature, not a product. This came up this week, past couple of weeks, with a couple of posts about Dropbox specifically, and some of the problems they're having. Evernote as well, kind of in that box where they made something, and now the bigger incumbents they were attempting to disrupt are basically doing all the things that they were doing as an integrated part of something everybody uses. My phone is now a flip camera, right? So that's gone. All of those you know, sort of companies that come and the criticism is, well, how does this become a company? It's really just a feature. So how do you kind of understand, you know, how do you guard against that? How do you, when you come up with a clever idea, you're inventing something, you're doing something new, how do you prevent yourself from just becoming a feature of one of your competitors' products once they learn how to imitate the feature?
Yeah, it's something that we think about all the time. You know, so for us, our biggest differentiation on from custom competitors is price. Brooks Brothers has, you know, is the kind of 800-pound gorilla in house space, and they also do a custom line. It happens to be 2.5 times more expensive than ours. But the reality is, what we're doing, it's not, you know, we're not NASA scientists. It's not super hard. We've done some stuff around supply chain. There's some just kind of natural retail pricing dynamics that allow us to do, you know, custom dress shirt for $95, for $750, etc. But it's something we think about all the time. Like, we'd be in a little bit of trouble if tomorrow Brooks Brothers started doing it out pricing. I think one of the defenses that we have is their current business is off the rack at our price, and they wouldn't completely, you know, they're not as gutsy as Amazon to get rid of books and introduce ebooks. They wouldn't get rid of their, you know, their current off the rack business to do custom at the same price. But it's something that we think about a lot. I know you wanted a good answer. I don't think I have one.
Just a commentary. I personally, like, I hate that question. That, like, are you a feature? Are you a product? Or are you a need to have or a want to have? It's like, come on, give me a break. Like, I'm a startup. I'm brand new. I didn't exist yesterday. How am I going to be a need to have today if I didn't exist yesterday? Obviously, people had another way to do it. Like, obviously, I'm a feature today because how am I going to build a full product day one? So, like, I think the answer is you make whatever your feature is really good and better than everybody else, or cheaper than everybody else, or you do something to make it better. And then over time, you develop it into a product. I mean, whether Dropbox or Evernote are able to do that, I don't know. But, like, obviously, they followed the right strategy to get as far as they did because they've made pretty big companies out of their features. So, like, it's you know, it's nice to sort of be up at an ivory tower and criticize that, but realistically, I think they probably did it the right way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's yeah, I'd say you just need to run fast. Everyone can do most businesses, right? There's no, you know, with us, we like to have, you know, key technology, and, you know, we rely on patents, and we have, you know, Babson, that light bulb company. That's protectable, but that's not the only thing we rely on. So I would say, you know, whoever can run the fastest will succeed. So, you know, a lot of these companies, when you're just starting out, you know, you worry that someone else can do exactly what you can do, and I always tell people, don't worry about that. Of course someone's gonna start doing what you're doing because it's a great idea. It's gonna be about who can run the fastest, work the hardest, you know, make the happiest customers. So, you know, it's not a reason not to do it.
I think Tesla's a great example of what you're talking about. They open sourced all of their intellectual property, right? And I think they're doing that because they have a bet that they can execute better than any of the automakers on the electric vehicle proposition, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe a couple different reasons why they did that. It was good PR, and there's
definitely
not
good PR.
a lot of
Standards play as well.
Yeah, and the IP that they released wasn't really what you need. But you know, yeah, no, I think it's you know, it's the greater, you know, the bigger the market, the bigger you're going to be. It's a small piece of the big pie. You know, we struggle with that. You know, at IdeaPaint, a lot of, okay, you know, there's huge paint companies out there. You know, why won't Sherwin-Williams or Benjamin Moore just come crush us? You know, if I could figure out how to make IdeaPaint in, you know, my dorm room in the eTower, of course Sherwin-Williams would be able to figure this out. But you know, it's so.
But they don't, do they? I mean,
once they.
Do they?
Well, you gotta get big enough first. So, you know, I'd say before you have $10 million in revenue, no one's gonna care. So you have a little bit of time of just being small because they're gonna watch you. Same thing with the light bulb company. I know that, you know, GE sent out a company email to all their GE Lighting, to all their employees about us, and, you know, listed the patents. But it's just, you know, we're on their radar. They're not starting to build a light bulb that's just like ours yet. So you'll be on the radar, but no one will do anything about it until you really start making them feel the pain of taking away their revenue. And that doesn't even begin to happen until you're at least 10 million in revenue. Yeah. But we struggle with that IdeaPaint. You know, do we go license and say, okay, you know, Sherwin-Williams and Benjamin Moore, you can all make IdeaPaint also, and that's the way that we're gonna, like, you know, get out of the line of fire. But at the end of the day, the idea is about 2% of the value of the company, and the execution is, you know, 99%, 98%, whatever it is. It's just, you know, whoever can actually do the idea is what matters.
So why is it then that big companies have such a hard time executing? you look at Microsoft, right, they were once disrupted. Now they're being disrupted because they can't do mobile, they can't do the cloud, they just can't freaking do it. You know, why is that?
Comment.
What's the core of that? Most people know about the innovators going on, right?
So here's the thing. I mean, we talked about advisors in the last talk and things like that. You know, everyone thinks they know how to do something, but the people that succeed are the ones that are too dumb to know not what to do. I mean, I look at what we do today versus what we did a year ago, and everything takes twice as long. Okay, maybe we're better at it, but we were really good before, and we were able to beat our competitors because we were too dumb to know that we had to go through all the steps. We just would skip things, and so I think that they're all very they're just too slow, and they kind of fall over themselves.
They have a lot of knowledge that kind of gets in the way of doing something differently.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a level of fear also about cannibalizing your own core business by trying new things. And so for instance, for us, we've got a subscription revenue business, and we just launched an a la carte basis where people can pay for access to our data without having to get a subscription. And we were afraid that we could piss off our existing subscription customers, but we're like, who are we kidding ourselves? Like, we're too small of a company. We don't have enough of those subscription revenue customers to not be willing to take that risk to piss them off. But the big incumbent in our space, they're going to be afraid of that. They've got a lot of subscription revenue customers, and for them to take an approach like that would be a bigger risk for them, and they're just not willing to take those kind of risks. And being able to take risks is kind of key to being able to do that.
Well, that's a good one to end this portion on. I wanted to open and create plenty of time for people to ask questions from the group here. Hands coming up.
Yeah, question for everyone. Are you ever afraid that your startup would one day end up becoming like Microsoft, where it becomes a big corporation
I love that problem.
disrupting harder because of all the bureaucracy, that kind of stuff?
Have you seen the size of Paul Allen's boat? He's got a boat in science boat.
I'm kind of afraid of it. I mean, I think so we're up to, I don't know, roughly 50 employees, I guess, and things change as you grow as a company. Things take more time to get done to some extent. You don't know all of your employees as well. You can't just people. You think you're in an environment where everybody feels comfortable just criticizing an idea any second or bringing up a new idea any second, and then you realize all of a sudden that there are some people in the company who don't feel comfortable doing that anymore, and you're like, what happened? And what number of employees did I get to a point where people are no longer comfortable just speaking up anymore? And I never told them that they shouldn't be comfortable, so why aren't they? Why is that happening? And it's like, how do I stop that? How do I make sure everybody feels that way? And you want to maintain that constant culture of innovation and a culture of never sort of being kind of content with where you are, and yet things change as you grow. And I don't know that there's an easy solution to fix it.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's in the beginning, it changes. So in the beginning, it's all about doing, right? You're having to do everything, and you're all about action and getting the stuff done. And it changes to where you're more of an enabler of people, and you're worried about what you're talking about is making sure you have an environment where great people want to work and they feel comfortable to interact. And so your role changes, but I think for me that's kind of the fun part, because I've played the scrappy garage entrepreneur, and I love that, but it's a new challenge where now it's more about people and employees and creating the right dynamic and putting the right team together. So it's less dependent on what you do and more dependent on what other people do, and making sure you have all the right ingredients to let them make some magic. So it's a new challenge, which I think is kind of fun. And for me, I want to see how far I can take it. At some point, all of us are likely to get fired from our businesses. One thing when I raised my first round of financing for IdeaPaint, they said, John, all right, so my lawyer sat me down, he's like, there's two things that are going to happen. One, they're going to fire you, and if you last at least a year, you're doing great, and they're going to try to steal your stock. I'm like, okay, where do I sign? Yeah, and I think it's very rare to have an entrepreneur that can go from, just the idea to selling the company or going IPO. Typically it's a different type of person because you need to be able to do different things along the way. So I think it's kind of fun to see how far I can take this one. But at some point, they'll still fire me, and that'll be fine.
So your boat gets bigger, as it were, and it's inevitable that it's going to be harder to turn, and they might throw you off, right? But what, I mean, there are companies that have grown to scale and preserve some of that entrepreneurial culture. Do you guys have examples of that you look to for inspiration? Companies that you think are still nimble at, 800 pounds?
Yeah, we had a chance to, this is an easy example, I don't think of a more creative one, but Google's done an incredible job of focusing on talent. I know companies that got acquired by Google, and talk to a lot of M&A people, and they buy companies because of the people. And I think a lot of companies are like that, where they say, look, we want to have that injection of motivated talent that has been able to create something out of nothing. And that's where the valuations are coming from. People say, oh my gosh, can't believe they bought Nest for $3 billion. Well, they didn't buy Nest for $3 billion because they had huge revenues. They bought it because they thought the team would be an integral part of keeping Google fresh and having that vision. So I think they're one good example.
Yeah, I think that, to answer that question, we're in a pretty different space where I really respect, not for all of their attributes, but for this attribute specifically, for the fact that they're continuing to be a going concern. But companies like Nike or Starbucks, or where they're in fairly trend-based markets where there isn't much IP, there's not that much defensibility, and it's more about doing the same. It's more about that friendly greeting that you get when you go to Starbucks, and they remember your name, and sometimes spell it wrong. But it's more about they just being able to continue to be patiently executing over 2-3 decades. I find that really impressive. I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs that are super ADD, and they can't sit down, and they want to come up with a big new idea, even if it doesn't serve their customers, just because they need to scratch that itch. But these guys continue to do a lot of the same things every year and continue to grow and throw off hundreds of millions of dollars of profitability. I'm personally impressed by that.
I want to add one thing, just 'cause I think it's nice to think about where we could all be, a big company, and these problems that you'll have, you said, glad to have those problems. But kind of just bring it back to something that might be more helpful for you guys. One thing I learned in this company is it comes from young people. Hiring the fresh person right out of college, 22 years old, 23-year-olds. Those are the people who have gotten add the most value to our company. When I first took on my Series A, I went in and hired a head of R&D, a VP of sales, a VP of marketing, VP of operations, and these guys had amazing resumes, and we paid the fee that it took to get guys from GE and the big companies in, and they didn't know how to do it. I fired all of them except for one. And today, I look at my operations, it's run by 2 25-year-olds, and they're kicking butt, and we have factories around the world, and they're doing great. So I think that innovation comes from young people, and so this image that I had in my mind of, I need experience, was, it just was a big waste of money. Hiring the young, eager, smart person is paid, 100 times better.
You'd rather have Jesse Pinkman in the lab than Walter White. Bring him in. Good. Other questions, please.
How do you keep team dynamics fresh? So, for example, after you started your journey, you have your team, you've been working together for some amount of time. How do you keep new ideas rolling? How do you keep the relationships growing?
That's a good question.
I have a personal experience that might be relevant here. So we had a manufacturing problem. We just fell on our face and we couldn't make a single light bulb. We had a big order from Home Depot. We're supposed to build 500,000 of them. I had to call Home Depot and say, hey, we just can't even build one. So I ended up I moved to China in December and stayed there until April, and just knew that we had to fix the operation in order for the business to survive. It was one of those moments. And back in Boston, I had 30 engineers, and I just wasn't there. So the team kind of started falling apart. I had people quitting. I had one of my VPs firing great guys, and everyone else calling me and saying, "Can you believe that Jeff got fired? He was our best friend. He's doing awesome. How did this happen?" So I came back, and frankly, the team was a little bit in shambles. So I take a long time to think about, okay, what what can I do to actually bring the team back together? And I think we've done it. And one thing is that people that don't like their jobs is because they have a bad boss. I think it's always the boss. If they're not happy at work, it's because they don't enjoy the person they work for. So you need to have, I think the management by support, it's the boss that says, how can I help you get your job done? It's not the boss with a hammer hitting you every day saying, why isn't it done, why isn't it done? And I think it starts there. And then, there's this expectation of working at a startup. People want to have kind of a fun job. I'm trying to get people that are going to go work at Apple, and that's, a pretty awesome place to work. So I need to be able to, just make being at work a place that you want to be. I'm not a foosball throwing or foosball playing, Nerf ball throwing kind of a startup. But simple things like having a stock kitchen and doing like company outings, that kind of stuff. It goes a long way. So people who are friends with each other work better together.
But just to be sure, you do walk them to the desks, right?
I think company traditions, for lack of a better term, or rituals. Rituals are kind of a good thing. So we do a weekly happy hour, and we do it every week, and like we make sure that like we've got a ton of beer in the fridge ready to go for that, so that everybody doesn't leave because like, oh, we're out of beer. You know what I mean? We make sure that we have a retreat every year that we go on that's really awesome, and we do happy hours and dinners and things like that, and try to like have things that sort of become inherent and to our culture that always kind of live on regardless of how the team grows. That people can sort of get around. And I agree with also the typical kind of startup perks and things like that, but also embracing those things as like important. Like my co-founder and I go and play darts in the middle of the day in the office or ping pong or whatever, because and partly because we feel like it, partly because we want like everybody to know that's okay. That's part of our culture. Like we don't want that to change. And it's important to sort of I think continue to set the example that certain things like that aren't going to change as you grow.
What you do affects what the people around you are going to do.
Yeah, I think in addition to those behaviors, if you're interested in people dynamics and culture, I highly recommend it's Netflix. Yeah, Netflix's Culture Deck. You can just Google Netflix Culture Deck. It's a 100-page deck, which is just fantastic. Really transparent as to how they run their people ops. And one of the key takeaways for me from that deck was they really try to manage via context rather than control. And they find that people are happier that way, they get more autonomy. And so basically what they're trying to say is if you give people the context, either transparency around the strategy, around even the P&L, what are some of the, what's at stake, that's a much more effective way of keeping people engaged and actually getting better results than, as John said, kind of, hey, have you done this yet? Have you done this yet? Which is a control pod. And, but yeah, if you're interested in more, I'd highly recommend checking that out.
Cool. I think we have time for a couple more questions. One or two more at least. Yeah, back.
You guys hear me?
Sure.
So going back to the earlier points of bigger companies not being as agile, being able to kind of pivot as the market changes. You guys think there's kind of the benefits of trying to potentially stay smaller as you kind of try to find your bearings in your marketplace and in your niche?
Don't grow too fast, you mean? Don't get too big too fast?
And how do you guys kind of
No, just get big as fast as you can.
I always view it as you're building a machine, and before you put all the gas in and crank it up, you want to make sure it's running properly. And otherwise, the wheels are gonna fall off the bus. So stay small until your business model is working. We've had that problem too, where you're just so eager to go, you start spending money on something that the product's not really ready, or what you haven't really figured out your marketing. Do everything as small as possible. I talk to people who are raising millions of dollars in their Series A or big seed rounds, and it's like no, do everything as small as you can, because once you figure out, then you want to crank it up. And one of the biggest mistakes we made at IdeaPaint is we raised $5 million in our Series A, and it made us believe that we could do all these things, but we ended up getting nowhere because we weren't really ready for it.
I would agree with that entirely. I think the only caveat I would make is that constant growth is a really good thing. When people go to join a startup, you know, they're in it because they want to feel like they're on a rocket ship. They want to feel like they're in a company that's constantly growing. And so growing a whole lot and then having no growth for a while really kind of just, you can feel it. You can feel that people are wondering what's going on. Why did we stop growing? But if you can, you know, if you can grow your hires and different aspects of your business on a pretty steady upward trend, people constantly feel like things are moving in the right direction, and that's kind of the feeling you want your employees to have.
So momentum, and also kind of tuning, right? The key thing before your machine can grow. I think we've got time for one more question. Go ahead, please, Gary.
When you're like at a very early stage and you are trying to keep things tight but still offer those competitive salaries to have people who would otherwise, you know, be at like Apple or some big company, how do you find a couple of people who are pretty much as excited as you are about what you're coming up with?
So how do you find people when you don't have the resources to pay them as well as they might be paid at a bigger company?
Well, yes, but if you are paying them as well, how do you make sure that it's...
When you do have the resources, how do you make sure people aren't coming for the money, but they're coming for the passion, for the idea? What's the test? What's the Turing test for?
All right. So one thing we do.
He's all the secrets.
No. I think we have I've had a little experience with some of these, but in the beginning, people who want the big salary, don't hire them. You need to hire people who are willing to take small salaries. They're in for the stock. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So we'll start there. But once you do have the money, you are paying people big salaries. One thing we do is we offer cash or stock in lieu of cash, so people can trade up to 10% of their salary to get more stock options. And it gives me a very clear list of who are the people that like are gung ho and believe in this company and who's just here for a paycheck. And it's interesting where that's a key indicator for me where you can actually see in their work the way they behave. Is reflected right there. You can see that the hardest working people are the ones that want the stock.
Unfortunately, that's a test that comes after you've hired them, I think, right?
Yeah.
There's no way to apply that.
Yeah. Oh, good question. How to apply it beforehand. You guys have any answers?
Well, you know, we just hired somebody who was just incredibly well researched about the company, knew the ins and outs of everything, and just constantly throughout the interview process conveyed their excitement around what we were doing. And you know, I think a lot of times you'll hear it from them. It wasn't like a particular question asked. It was just so obvious in sort of the background of everything they said that they were just so excited to come work for us and that this is where they wanted to be. And I think that, all things being equal, I think that person over the person who was, doesn't have that attitude all the time, and even someone who probably has a little less experience or isn't, maybe a slightly better fit, I think that person all day long. It's always feels good to be like that. It reflects in the way their attitude and the way they push their work.
Yeah, I think just piggybacking off Mike, you can set the bar pretty high in the interview process. You have pretty high expectations of, I want a deck on what the marketing strategy for this company should be, and that's setting a pretty high bar. That's 12 hours, that's 12, 20 hours of work. And if they're not up for it, that's a pretty good litmus test of are they really excited and believe in what we're doing, And I think for you as the founder, it's really on you to get them excited to actually want to do that work. If you can't convey your vision, your passion about why this is disruptive or undisruptive, then that's kind of on you. But I think that setting the high, especially for the first couple of people, setting the bar very high for hiring is really important.
Great. Good. I think that's about all we have time for.
I think this guy's been super excited.
All right. One more.
Thank you. Question. How does your company view competition? Is this something you guys talk about every day in your office? Is it something that specific meetings about, or what is the general kind of consensus on that?
So should you pay too much attention, or should you pay attention to what your competitors are doing, or should you forget them?
I think it depends on the dynamics of your business. So for us, custom is 1% of the total menswear market, and all of our customers come from off the rack. A small percentage of them have heard about competitors or have done custom before, but the large majority of them haven't. And so, it would be silly for us to say, let's focus on the other 1% of the market rather than focusing on the other 99%.
Yeah, I would say, don't fixate on it. The first knockoff IdeaPaint that was launched, I had an all-company meeting where, it was like a we're all gonna die kind of a moment. And we didn't all die, so it was unnecessary. So, the way we do it now is once a quarter, we, do a survey of the market, see where competitors are at, talk about price points, what they're doing from a marketing standpoint. You shouldn't be reactionary. I mean, you should be playing you should be setting the deck to be able to win at your own game, right? You should be able to, take your own path and execute on that, and be aware of what's around you. But if you're trying to react to your competitors, you're always going to be a step behind. Whereas, you really want to, set the deck so that you guys are on your own path.
I think that to some extent it depends on what stage your competitor is at. So if you're a startup and you're coming in to disrupt an established player, don't think about them at all. Like, they've been around forever, they're going to continue to be around. Eventually you'll chip away at them or you'll disrupt them, but what you're doing is not going to, like John said before, if you don't have $10 million in revenue, they're not going to be paying that much attention to you, and they're not going to change their business that much. In our space, there are two companies, not directly competitive to us, but in the commercial real estate tech space, that literally started just around the same time. They're going after the same customers, and they're building almost the same product, and they think about each other all day long, every day. And I think that's the right attitude, because they're constantly trying to sell to the same customers, and they need to keep one-upping each other nonstop, or else they're going to lose to the other one. And I think that's what they need to do, and it drives them both to be much, much better. And ultimately, the customers really appreciate it because they like that competition because it's making the products better. So I think that if you've got somebody who's much more your peer in the industry and legitimately is going to be able to take your customers away, and it's a limited market, you should be thinking more about your competitor than if it's a big company and you're the little guy, and then you probably should just ignore them for the most part and focus on making your business great.
All right. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for coming out.